It's been 5 years since we wrote Designing Disorder. It's a book that explored how to design cities for unpredictable social interaction and improvisation, which facilitate contact between people, which inspire tolerance towards difference, where people take collective action that challenge imposed orders. And the book brought kind of like a breeze of optimism. It tells the reader how cities could be better. However, during the last 5 years, we've witnessed multiple crises. We had the COVID-19 pandemic, which brought both solidarity, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, but then also exacerbated inequalities between people. We have more frequent natural disasters caused by climate change and that are devastating cities and people's lives. We have also war and crimes against humanity, growing inequalities and poverty, and the rise of the far right. It's a difficult time to be an optimist, but cities are places where these inequalities and these crises are made more visible. But at the same time, cities are places for contesting these inequalities and self-organize. So how can cities and the craft of city making as well address these challenges? What do you think?
I would say that one thing that is striking to me about the current crisis in America is that the spaces of resistance are all public spaces in large cities. The larger the city, the more possibilities of resistance are becoming manifest. So, as urbanists, we want to ask, well, why is that? Is there something about the size of the city, or is there something about the kinds of public spaces size enables? What I've observed in those crises in the last month or so is that spaces in which people are visible to one another, that is, plazas rather than streets, tend to be magnetic spaces drawing people in to protest. There are unfortunately also spaces in which the authorities can react by throwing tear gas or whatever. But as a magnet for protest, and spontaneous protest, which is a large part of what our book wants to see, that form is enabling.
Our book makes reference to the 2011 uprising that happened first in a few Arab countries, then in Spain with the 15M, and then also in the US and in other cities with the Occupy movement. At that moment, I think there was kind of like an emergence of the new left that was happening, which now seems to be kind of like very much dormant.
So I think that what we're seeing is, at least in Europe, is a kind of reconfiguration of the meaning of the popular, which is divorced from political parties. So I think we're in the moment of a kind of reformation rather than decline. Now, I want to believe that.
Yeah, of course. And I think our book, it's less about the formation of political parties, more about the type of associationism that happens between people. And
I think we're going to see an upwelling of that.
Yeah, and I think that relates to some of the things that you've written before, particularly around the provision of welfare. I think you've written before about how welfare in society could be provided through like a two-tier system, one provided by the state that provides the basic services such as housing, education, health, and some resources, and another one in a second tier that I think you wrote that it was inspired in the Alcoholics Anonymous structure, which is more around mutual support between each other, and how that could build like another layer of welfare. And another thing that you've written about, which I think relates very much to how people associate rather in different forms than political parties, is this structure that you've discussed around the guilds as a form of association and cooperation that is inspired more on labor and where people work. That is similar to trade unions, but they provide something more than that. They provide care support, and they have this social security also functionality. And since this is the Basque Country Architecture Bienal, I was thinking that this structure of the guilds that you mentioned is very similar to large cooperatives. The Basque Country is home to, I think, it's the largest industrial cooperative in the world, which is called Mondragon. Mondragon was formed in the post-war Spain, and it's a conglomerate of cooperatives that, in a way, grew out of necessity of the different layers of care and social security. They provide different layers of welfare to people, in addition to the welfare that is provided by the Spanish state. There's like different layers of welfare that is provided by the cooperative, and I think it does have similar to the idea of the guilds that you discuss. But when you discuss the guilds, explore history to think about the future and how we can learn from history for relearning that craft of cooperation.
You know, I'd rephrase that a little differently, if I may say so.
Okay.
Which is that it's not history so much. People have a necessity to cooperate from the earliest ages of human life. Life has to be sustained by cooperation. And what neoliberalism did was put this sort of basic truth, which is true from generation to generation to generation, to say that that's also only something that applies to being a child, that an adult is a non-cooperative but a competitive human being instead. And I think that basically we're just seeing that temporary push aside being exposed as something that's not sustainable. So I wouldn't say this is the past. I'd say what we've had in the last half century is something rather exceptional, which is a kind of colonization of people's notion of what it is to live with other people. To me, this is like a sort of dark storm cloud that is spread over society and will pass. If you do look into the past, what you see all the time, even in the most monarchical regimes, is this secondary layer of everyday support. You know, it's happened because it needed to happen. Middle Eastern cities where there was very little sort of basic government support. I'm thinking of places like Damascus in the 19th century or something like that. There was huge tissue of Islamic waqfs, you know, and cooperative associations that do what a basically very weak state wasn't doing. So the question to me, as a social analyst for this, is why did we allow this storm to pass over? What were the ways in which people suddenly decided that when you're an adult, you're no longer involved in these cooperative relationships? So it's a kind of what Giorgio Agamben calls a state of exception. How did that happen to us that it was swept aside? And I think that one of the reasons that I'm not very optimistic, but I'm optimistic, is just that the need for this kind of mutual support never goes away. Even to something as fundamental as, if you're going out to work, who will take care of the children? Or if you're sick, who will go shop for you? All of those kinds of just sort of elemental conditions of being able to stay alive need to be relegitimated in a way as a result of this. What I think of neoliberalism as kind of sickness, the kind of social, emotional sickness. That's my view of this. Why I say the notion that it was in the past and now we've lost that past, I think is the wrong framing. We're just in a moment in which this need has been delegitimated. Yep. And so we see everything like transition from childhood to adulthood as something which is desocializing. It's not that I'm more optimistic, I would say. It's just that I think we need to be realistic about what human beings need in order to live.
And I think we do have that tendency. I think everyone likes to have their network of support living in their places.
They need it.
As you said, in case you need to call someone quickly to pick up your child from school because you can't, or in case you break your leg and you need someone to do the grocery shopping for you and things like that. So I think we seek for that networks of support in cities. But I mean, what type of spaces do we need for this cooperation? In some of the research that I've been doing with my colleague here at UCL, with Daniel Fitzpatrick, we've been looking at different forms of community ownership. Things like large housing cooperatives, or even community ownerships in relationship to land and to agricultural land. And I think something that we've seen in those in a piece of research we've been doing is that it changes people's mindset completely. It's a mindset of collective ownership that is very much different from this idea of competition. It's a change of mindset for looking towards the collective good rather than for the individual good. So I think that's something that it definitely, those type of spaces and forms of governance, they do change people mindset.
Don't you think there's a difference between mutuality and solidarity? Because solidarity does sort of assume that everybody is united in one pursuit. Whereas in most cooperatives, they're based on mutuality, which is that there's a give and take. You're not necessarily your neighbor. You don't identify with them. But there are things you need to do, which you can only do together. And it's, for me, one of the reasons that I'm interested in cooperation is that because of this distinction, that I think cooperation is stronger when it's mutual than when it's based on solidarity of everybody sharing, say, a common identity. I think that's a weak basis for cooperation.
I think cooperation is stronger when people that you are cooperating with are not necessarily in your close friend relationship.
And that's where the city comes in.
Exactly. So when you have that situation where you're just not cooperating with your immediate neighbors, but with something much bigger, like a system where you give and take, as you say.
And which you design the infrastructure for that in our book, which maybe takes us to the question about technology.
Yeah.
What's in your mind about whether AI could actually enable this kind of mutuality, this kind of cooperative work?
It's in early stages, so it's hard to say. The issue with AI, it reminds me of the beginnings of the internet. I remember at the beginnings of the internet, when I was starting my architecture degree, I remember I had this professor at the university, Jose Perez de Lama. He was very much inspired by the work of your friend, William Mitchell. And he looked at technology, at the internet mainly. He had an association called Hackitectura, like hack and architecture. He saw the internet as something that was potentially emancipatory, liberating, as a tool for grassroots activism. But now we've seen how, in a way, technology and the internet are dominated by the big techs, all of them lined up in Trump's inauguration. So I think that, there's a big question on AI, whether we will let big corporations to take AI and dominate it, on whether there is an opportunity to hack it in a certain way and use it for mobilizing.
How would you think about AI in terms of your interests in cities? How could it enable sort of the creation of these urban spaces that allow spontaneous mutual association or informal association?
You think about AI, and there is the issue of data associated to it, where the data come from and how the data is shared, which is that data that you would need potentially to facilitate more self-organization or have the not facilitate more self-organization, have the knowledge that you may need for about what people want in a particular area or things like that. I think one of the key things would be to think about to what extent that data and the access to data could be democratized rather than in possession of a few big techs. I mean, there are now two forms of AI that are popularly used by everyone. Let's say they are very accessible to the public, which are the text generator and the image generator. The question is what comes after that as well. I mean, what are the other tools that we can have from that?
That given the kind of AI that we have at the moment, that it tends to have something like a nervous breakdown when it's confronted with situations in which judgment can't be based on association.
What if it's us humans who introduce certain judgment into that?
So I mean, what I think about this in terms of cities, the whole issue with AI is that the machine would do the thinking rather than you do the thinking. It would think more and you'd think less. That's the way it's set up now. Neurologically, it's planar rather than deep-seated. So that's the trade-off we have now. And for that reason, I think for us to think, we have to go back to a different way of thinking about what tech does, which is provide lots of raw data, which can be processed, but it can't be processed in a way where it's doing this kind of reductive, error-prone kind of work. How that relates to cities is that you can run a system like Songdo, which does all the thinking for you. You don't need to think about how much energy you have because it's thought it out. Songdo is an economic disaster. Everything is laid out. It's all intelligent in that kind of lower order sense. And people feel stifled by it. And the reason for that, I think, is profoundly connected to the kind of place that it is. And that's what our book, disruption is the key to us of kind of what we're doing.
Yeah, I'm going to go back probably to those disruptions. I think in the book we talk about infrastructures for disorder that create conditions for social interaction, unpredictable activities, improvisation, and this idea of the open-ended city that is very much inspired by your idea of an open system, an open city or an open system versus a closed one. But we find that in capitalism tends to do always a closed city that is kind of like rigid and unpredictable. So in a way, we need those disruptions. So, and in the book, we do look at how technology could also be a tool for disrupting that. I think we looked at issues like how collectivizing resources can be a forms of disruption into this that potentially create...
Or it can be open-ended. I mean, when you do community budgeting, and you have 80,000, 100,000 people poring over a set of budgets, as you do in some Brazilian cities, that's a good use of technology. My feeling about this is that what happens in most tool use is that the first stages of using a tool are the clunkiest. This was true in the development of the scalpel, the sharp razor. The first uses of it are to us horrifyingly simple. And I think that's digitally, it's the same sort of thing. What this has created, this simplicity is something that can be exploited economically. Mm-hmm. But I think the more sophisticated the technology becomes, the less it will be. That's, again, optimistic on my part. You'll have more things like Linux systems and fewer things like Microsoft. And in a way, it's very logical. When you have some new resource, you use it in an old way to solve an old problem.
We discuss a lot in the book about co-design and co-production, and this is something that we've also discussed at different levels. But I think something we discuss about when we think about co-design and co-production, rather than on the long conversations with local communities, we also think about what type of interventions enable collective action. And I think that's something that is quite important. What type of cooperation, what type of interventions enable that people will self-organize and cooperate together in crafting and shaping their places where they live. And we were talking before about this idea that neoliberalism has, in a way, hindered the human capacity of collaborating, but I think we both see an opportunity in city making and in recovering that.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's something that I've seen, particularly when people self-organized on building, for example, their own social center. Then suddenly they gain back that capacity. I was thinking, I used to visit a lot with my students Can Batlló in Barcelona. I don't know if you've heard about Can Batlló in the Sants neighborhood in Barcelona.
Yeah.
And it's a very interesting place because it was a former factory of, I think it was textiles, but the city plan had it as a potential social infrastructure, like for the city, but it never actioned that land use, let's say. So the neighbors, the people that live around, self-organize and say, okay, if you don't do it, we'll occupy it, I think they said in 100 days or something like that, and we'll start doing it ourselves. So they start giving the local authority kind of like a deadline to do that. And then I think it was something like 2 days before the deadline, the local authority gave the residents the keys. And then the residents started they built their own library using secondhand books. They built their own cafe. Then they started using this space as a place to think about housing co-ops, and a housing co-op emerged from that in a neighboring plot. And now they've built more partnerships with the local authority and with other stakeholders. Now I think they have like a place to create labor cooperatives. I think the local authority is going to move the archives in the same place. Every year that we visit Can Batlló, it had grown, and there were more stuff, like a workshop, a circus school, and I don't know, different kind of things. And it was this idea of the pride on collective action that they had, what I found very inspiring.
Which
that kind
is very important.
Yeah, that kind of like almost like a joy of collaborating that they had. What do you think about this potential of recovering this craft of collaborating or enhancing the one that we have already through city making, through creating places together?
I think at a practical level for us here in Britain, that's framed in a very tragic fashion, which is the huge housing shortage, not just in London, but in most British cities. And the tragedy is that there's lots of abandoned or semi-abandoned spaces, mostly commercial spaces, which are no longer viable, which could be transformed into housing. Who will do that? The British government is too unimaginative to see that. My thought about this, and I've been working with people on this, is how cooperatives could force these local councils to let the cooperatives transform these, abandoned commercial spaces into housing. And that's a specific project. It's failing so far in Tower Hamlets, which is the poorest part of London, but rather more successful in cities like Cambridge or Bristol. That's something where cooperative action deals with a real failure in the planning system. But it is a strategy for starting to do something which gives people both the opportunity to cooperate and also the opportunity to create value.
In the British planning system, you have the Office to Housing Conversion, but that what has materialized is that all the housing speculators have transformed. So that's a colleague of mine here at Ben Clifford has done a lot of research on on how the poor quality of housing the housing speculators have made in offices. But you're saying something quite different, which is how housing cooperatives, so the people that are going to live there, could also transform those spaces, which I think would definitely lead to better quality housing when people are going to live there. One final question: where do we find these infrastructures for disorder today? Where do you think we find these infrastructures for disorder today?
The thing about neoliberalism is that it leaves a lot of garbage behind it. And that garbage includes, local shops which are collapsed, libraries which are under-resourced, which aren't chic. It leaves entire neighborhoods which can't be gentrified. It just ignores them. So it's a system of waste. That's how I look at neoliberalism. We're producing an enormous amount of just material it's not interested in because it can't make money out of it. And that's, to me, where the kinds of thinking that's involved in our book.
That's the places of opportunity, those places where,
that's right.
Where these moments of resistance and contesting.
Right. Well, you won't have resistance because because there's no money to be made. You'll have neglect. Neglect is an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
It creates an opportunity. But it's not been a good period we've lived through. But it will pass.
No, but I think, as you said, just to conclude, that humans, we do have somewhere near us the will to cooperate and live together. That's why cities were formed through cooperation and through humans liking being next to each other and
needing to be
next to each other. So cities are also kind of like the answer to a lot of these problems. They've been turned into these neoliberal machines, but the origin is actually origins of cooperation that we definitely can get back on track.
And the fun thing I say about this, and I guess this is why, as somebody living in London, I have a certain kind of optimism. I've lived here long enough, nearly 60 years now, to see the neoliberalism come and go. The city is being abandoned by its rich people. They're going somewhere else. It's that kind of curve. The same thing is true in New York, which is now a city people are leaving who have the money to go somewhere else. And, it's a kind of history which is not linear, where, gentrification gets bigger and bigger and bigger and never stops. It comes and goes. And we're at the period of going, which is, as I say, I think that's an opportunity for people who are not rich to assert their agency. And the kind of work you're doing is a practical way to do that.